So the daily problem is construct quad tree, which is sort of an interesting idea. I guess a quad tree is you're given this array of ones and zeros, and what you want to do is have each quadrant be a different node in the quad tree. So the root node is just represents the entire square, and then the four child nodes of that root node are each quadrant of the entire square, and then the four child nodes of those are each quadrant of that square, and so on. And then the idea is like this quadrant is all ones, so we don't need to have any root nodes. We just say, okay, cool, this whole quadrant is just one leaf node. Same with this one, same with this one. But this quadrant of the root node has to have four quadrants, with them, which themselves all have one quadrant needed. So there's these four leaf nodes here that connect up to this quadrant, and then this quadrant and these three leaf nodes connect back up to the root quadrant. And we can see that right here. These four leaf nodes that connect up to this quadrant, these four leaf nodes that connect up to this root. This has got to be one of the longest problem explanations that there is. And it's actually kind of surprising. It's got a lot of downvotes, but the acceptance rate is quite high, which tells me that probably a lot of people just were confused by this description. And then once they read through the whole thing, it was like, well, that was a waste of time. So I'll just go over my solution because it's like kind of finicky to have to rewrite, but it's fairly simple to think through. So my strategy was just, okay, we know grid can only go up to 2 to the 6th by 2 to the 6th. So it can only be 64 by 64 at worst, which is what? 256, no, 512. Nope, okay, I was wrong. 4096 squares. So what I do is I just immediately say, all right, make a new grid that's just the exact same thing, but with nodes instead of numbers. And then what those nodes have are that number is the value, and they're all leaves. And then I kind of go through and I say, okay, now that we have these, there's no way to get around the fact that we're going to have to compare every number. There's no way that you can get to this quadrant being a leaf node without verifying that every one of these ones is the same. But you don't necessarily want to be like, oh, well, like check this 4x4 square. Does that work? No, check a 2x2. Does that work? Like you don't necessarily want to do that. You might as well just go bottom up and say, what's this square? What's this square? What's this square? And then say, hey, does this 2x2 work? Is this like a leaf node, or do I have to have more granularity than that? Do I have to like specify each one of these because they're not all the same? What about this 2x2? And then once you have all those, then you say, hey, what about this 2x2 of those nodes that I'd previously established? What do those look like? And that's what I do. So this is for z in range depth. And depth, I just immediately start and I say, it's the logarithm of the length of the grid. So however long this grid is, log base 2 of that is going to be how many nodes, like the depth of the tree maximum. So for example, here there's 8. So the depth is going to be 3. And the idea is we potentially have all of these as their own nodes. And then each of these 2x2 quadrants of those nodes, and then each of those two, and then 4x4 quadrant of each of those 2x2 quadrants, and then finally a 8x8 quadrant of each of those 4x4 quadrants. So I guess that could be 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's off by 1, but the logic that I've written, it doesn't really matter. And the main reason why is because the first thing I do is I say, all right, before you get into the depth or whatever, just make each node its own square. Make each leaf node its own square. Make each square its own leaf node. And then do this depth times. So I guess like if this were a tree, the maximum depth would really be 4. But really what I would want to do if I was being very explicit is just like that. But doesn't really matter. Anyway, and then I iterate through and I say, okay, go from 0 up to n, and then iterate by 2 to the power of depth plus 1, but 2 bit shifted over by the current depth that we're in. So for example, if we're looking at these 1x1s, then we want to increment by 1 every time to set that node, which is what we're doing here. And then we want to say, okay, well, when depth is 0, quote unquote. Really what we're talking about is this like 2x2 here that we want to compare, and then this 2x2 that we want to compare, and this 2x2 that we want to compare. So we're moving over by 2 every time. And then the next one, we're going to have this 4x4, and then we're going to move over 4 to this 4x4. So that's why these are in increments of 2 bits shifted over to the current depth level. And then I make a new node. And what I do is I just have the node in the top left corner, just because that's really easy to be like, okay, this node, this node, this node, and this node. And then also to compare, you can just be like this node compared with, or the new node we just made, compare it with this node, this node, this node, and this node to get this entire thing. And as you can see, like when we're assembling a certain kind of like node, we want to increment over. If we're moving to the next thing to assemble, let's say this quadrant, and we add 4 to I to get from one quadrant to the other, in order to compare the subquadrants within this quadrant, we just add half of that. So instead of going like, hey, make this quadrant, now make that quadrant, now make this quadrant, now make this quadrant, instead of doing that, we're saying, hey, make, like, when you're making this quadrant, compare this subquadrant, and then this subquadrant, and then this one, and then this one. So that's why the increment size here is 2 bit shifted to the z. But then for the children, I'm saying, hey, take the nodes that are at these specific indices of I and j. These are special. We've set these. So that's why this is then 1 bit shifted to the z. That's the offset here. So you have I and j. Like if we're checking, for example, this quadrant, we're checking, okay, I and j itself. I and j plus 1 bit shifted over to the z. I plus 1 bit shifted over to the z. And then I plus 1 bit shifted to the z, j plus 1 bit shifted to the z. And then for each child, for each subquadrant, we check these. And we say, hey, are they all the same? Are all of these ones? Are all these the same? Yes. What's the value? 1. Are all these the same? Is this a 1? Yes. This one, yes. So here we can say, okay, great. Get rid of those previous nodes. Now we have this quadrant, which is all one leaf node, because all of these values are the same and they're 1. So that's like what this is. Whereas this is saying if they're not the same, for example here, then we do need to have 4 of those leaf nodes as subquadrants. So do that. And then at the end, we start and we assemble each single square, and then each 2x2 square, and then each 4x4, and then each 8x8, all the way up to theoretically 64x64. And then in the end, we just return this top left node, because that's the node where every single time we assemble nodes, for example, like here, all of these zeros, we're comparing this quadrant, this quadrant, this quadrant, and this quadrant. And once we go, okay, cool, we now have this as one node, we set it to the top left. That's what this is doing. So in the end, we just say, okay, what's the top leftmost square? What's the node we've put in that spot? So that's this one. It's kind of an interesting, I mean, this is, you could definitely do this recursively, and I think it would be a lot less code, because this is recursive by nature. You're taking a quadrant, and then you're recursing with that relationship to a larger quadrant, and that relationship to an even larger quadrant, and so on. But it's a good challenge to do it iteratively. So that's the daily. Hopefully I can upload this within 2 minutes to help someone. Hit like if this helps.